Most people think the GT-R story starts with Nissan. It doesn't. It starts somewhere much stranger. It starts in the wreckage of a war, in a country that had just been told it could no longer build the very things its best engineers knew how to make. It starts with men who had spent years designing warplanes and suddenly found themselves with no sky left to build for. So they built roads instead. The car that became one of the most revered names in automotive history, a name whispered in garages from Tokyo to Manchester, from Detroit to Melbourne, didn't begin in a sleek design studio with polished drawings on the wall. It began in a factory that used to assemble aircraft for the Imperial Japanese Army. And the badge on the bonnet wasn't the one you're thinking of. It said Prince. If that name doesn't immediately ring a bell, that's the whole point of this video. The Prince Motor Company is one of the most consequential forgotten stories in automotive history. They built the car. They proved the concept. They sent it to a racetrack it had no business being on, and then quietly, completely they disappeared, absorbed, erased. Their name gone. Their engineers inherited by a bigger company that went on to take all the credit. But what those engineers left behind never went away. Today we're going back to where it really started. Not 1969. Not the famous GT-R badge. Further back to a family sedan that couldn't quite beat a Porsche, but came close enough to change the direction of an entire industry. Pay close attention. Because what happened between 1945 and 1966 in Japan is one of the most remarkable origin stories in motoring history, and almost nobody talks about it. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the Allied occupation forces imposed strict controls on Japanese industry. Aircraft manufacturing was banned outright. The engineering firms that had spent the war building fighters, bombers, and training aircraft were dissolved, renamed, redirected. Some folded entirely, others pivoted hard. The Tachikawa Aircraft Company was one of those firms. During the war they had manufactured aircraft for the Imperial Japanese Army, including parts for the Mitsubishi Zero. After the surrender, they had nothing. No contracts, no purpose, and no permission to do the one thing their workforce knew how to do with genuine excellence. So they started over. Early output was modest. A small electric vehicle called the Tama, running on lead-acid batteries, slow and limited in range. By today's standards, almost comically primitive. But the engineering instincts behind it were anything but primitive. These were people who had built aircraft. They understood structures, tolerances, weight distribution, and the relationship between a machine and the forces acting upon it at speed. That level of thinking was never going to be satisfied assembling something that topped out at 40 kilometers an hour. By 1952, through a series of mergers, breakups, and name changes that would require a proper flowchart to follow, the company settled on a new identity. They called themselves Prince, a tribute to Crown Prince Akihito, who had just been formally invested as heir to the imperial throne. In a country still rebuilding its national identity, brick by brick and factory by factory, naming your car company after the future emperor was not a casual marketing decision. It was a declaration. We are serious. We are here. We intend to matter. And they meant every word of it. The Prince Motor Company launched the Skyline in 1957. On the surface, it was a family car, 4 doors, a 1.5-liter engine producing around 60 horsepower, the kind of thing that belonged in the driveway of a modest suburban home in Tokyo. Nothing on a specification sheet would have made a manufacturer in Stuttgart or Coventry take notice. But look underneath. The 1957 Skyline had double wishbone front suspension, a level of engineering sophistication that had no obvious commercial justification in a car at that price point. It was the kind of decision only a team with an aircraft engineering background would make, not because the market demanded it, because they knew it was the right way to build it. These were men who had been trained to a standard where good enough was simply not an acceptable outcome. Prince also launched the Gloria around this time, a more upmarket saloon, intended to compete at a higher price point. The Skyway, a light commercial vehicle based on the Skyline platform, followed. The company was functioning, growing, building a customer base, But there was a tension inside Prince that went unspoken in the boardroom. Toyota and Nissan were the dominant forces in Japanese motoring. They had the distribution networks, the manufacturing scale, the decades of brand trust that come from being first. Prince was arguably producing more sophisticated engineering and selling considerably fewer cars. The outsider, with ambition, it couldn't yet translate into market dominance. There is always one language that cuts through that kind of problem, one arena where a smaller, technically superior outfit can humiliate a bigger, more comfortable rival in front of everyone. Racing. In 1962, Prince became the first Japanese car company to enter a works team in a European rally, the Liège-Sofia-Liège. A brutal long-distance event with an attrition rate above 80%, neither Skyline finished. But the point had been made. This was a company willing to go anywhere and compete against anyone. And in 1964, they found the moment that would define them. The second Japan Grand Prix was to be held at Suzuka Circuit on the 3rd of May. In Japan, in 1964, the year the Tokyo Olympics announced to the world that this country had rebuilt itself, a major motor race was not simply a sporting event. It was a statement of national capability. The cameras were rolling, the crowds were enormous. Every manufacturer, with any ambition to be taken seriously, wanted to be there. Prince decided not just to enter, they decided to win. They built 100 special versions of the Skyline, designated the S54, specifically to satisfy homologation requirements for the GT class. To fit a competitive engine under the bonnet, they took the standard Skyline 1500 body and extended the wheelbase by 20 centimeters, creating room for the 2-liter 6-cylinder G7 unit, originally designed for the larger, heavier Gloria. The race cars were fitted with Weber triple carburetors, a 5-speed close-ratio gearbox, and a limited slip differential. 100 cars built in a hurry, the first examples completed just 2 days before the race. Driver Yoshikazu Tsunako would later recall that initial testing was deeply unsettling. The extended wheelbase had upset the car's natural balance. The tires weren't right for the setup. In every corner, the car drifted and slid rather than gripping cleanly. By conventional measures, it was barely ready. Then Tsunako checked his lap time, 2 minutes and 47 seconds around Suzuka. He looked at that number and stopped worrying about the tires. At that point, he said, "I was proud to say this was the fastest car at Suzuka." He didn't know what was waiting for them on race morning. A Porsche arrived. Not just any Porsche. A 904 Carrera GTS, a factory racing machine from Stuttgart, mid-engined, purpose-built, aerodynamically sorted, with a racing pedigree that needed no introduction. It had been entered at the last minute by a private driver, almost as an afterthought. But a Porsche 904 was never an afterthought on a racetrack. It was the kind of machine that made experienced drivers quietly nervous. The Prince Skyline S54 was a stretched family sedan with a borrowed engine. On paper, the comparison was almost insulting. Nobody in the paddock gave Prince a realistic chance of staying with it, let alone challenging for the lead. Here is what actually happened on the 3rd of May, 1964. Driver Tetsu Ikuzawa in car number 41 went after the Porsche from the moment the flag dropped. The Skyline drifted in the corners just as it had in testing, but Ikuzawa used that drift rather than fighting it, carrying speed through the bends in a way that surprised everyone watching. And for one lap, one single, extraordinary lap, car number 41 passed the Porsche 904 and led the race. A stretched, Japanese family saloon, built in a hurry with the wrong tires, was leading a German factory racing car at the Japan Grand Prix. One lap, then the Porsche found its pace, retook the lead, and went on to win. But the final order told the real story. The Skylines finished 2nd through 6th. Car number 39, driven by Yoshikazu Tsunako, took 2nd place. The full top 5 in the GT class was Prince. 5 cars, all variants of the same stretched sedan, finishing behind only the one machine on that circuit specifically built for victory. In the grandstand, A 9-year-old boy named Toshiyuki Shiga watched and felt something shift permanently inside him. He later said that 1964 was the moment Japanese motorization truly began, the moment a domestic car proved it belonged on the same track as Europe's best. He decided that day he wanted to work for Nissan. He eventually became Nissan's chief operating officer, a child's entire life trajectory, redirected by one lap at Suzuka. Veteran racing driver Kazuyoshi Hoshino, who would himself become a national hero at Daytona nearly 30 years later, said the S54 was the car that lit the fire for him, the reason he went into motorsport. He called it the trigger. Pay attention to that word, a car that didn't win, a race that went to the Porsche. And yet the result sparked a future chief operating officer, a future national racing hero, and an engineering mission that would eventually produce one of the most dominant race cars Japan has ever built. Not because Prince won, because they came close enough, in a car that had no right to be that close, that the world finally had to take notice. Inside Prince, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was something closer to controlled fury. Chief engineer Shinichiro Sakurai, who had been at Prince since 1952 and was the technical architect of the Skyline program, began immediately planning the next move. They would not be caught out again. Sakurai's team developed a purpose-built mid-engine racing prototype, the Prince R380. Built on a modified Brabham BT8 chassis, clothed in an aerodynamic body, designed from the ground up to beat the Porsche at the next Japan Grand Prix. It won. In 1966, the R380 took the overall victory. But by the time that trophy was raised, something had already changed that no racing result could fix. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Every week we go back to the real stories behind the machines told straight, no mythology added. Hit subscribe, leave a comment below telling us whether you knew the GT-R story began with Prince. And if this is landing for you, share it with a friend who loves the history behind the cars. Now back to the moment everything changed. In May of 1965, Prince Motor Company announced it would merge with Nissan. The deal was completed in August of 1966. The official framing was industrial logic, two Japanese manufacturers combining strengths in a competitive global market. Rational, efficient, inevitable. But for the people inside Prince, it was something more complicated than that. Prince was the smaller company. Prince was the one being absorbed. The name, that deliberate, carefully chosen tribute to the Crown Prince, that declaration of national ambition, was quietly retired from the front of every car. What Nissan acquired went far deeper than product lines and tooling. They inherited an engineering culture, a way of thinking about cars that traced back, in an unbroken line, to men who had designed aircraft and refused to carry their old standards into a new industry. Nissan got the Skyline platform, the Gloria, the racing pedigree of the R380, and most critically, the people. Shinichiro Sakurai went with the deal. He was in his 40s. He had been at Prince since 1952, present for almost every significant decision in the Skyline's development. He had been the guiding intelligence behind the car's racing ambitions, the man who understood its potential more completely than anyone. If you have never heard his name before today, write it down. Because the next chapter of this story belongs entirely to him. Working now inside Nissan, Sakurai turned his attention to the third-generation Skyline, the C10, which the Japanese public would eventually nickname Hakosuka, a compression of two Japanese words, Hako, meaning box, and Suka, from Sukailine, meaning skyline, the box, Skyline. It launched in 1968, and it was still, outwardly, a saloon. 4 doors, upright proportions, entirely unremarkable to look at. But Sakurai was not interested in how it looked. In February of 1969, the Skyline 2000 GT-R was unveiled at the Tokyo Motor Show. The GT-R badge appeared in public for the first time, 3 letters standing for Gran Turismo Racer, and under that boxy, unprepossessing body was an engine that had no business being in a production car. The S20, 6 cylinders, inline, 24 valves, dual overhead camshafts, a displacement of 1,989 cubic centimeters. The engineering of this engine traced directly to the Prince R380 racing prototype technology developed for a purpose-built racing machine, now sitting in a 4-door saloon, available at a dealership. 160 horsepower in 1969, paired with 4-wheel independent suspension and a 5-speed gearbox. The Hakosuka GT-R then did something that, even now, is almost difficult to believe. It won 52 consecutive races in Japanese touring car competition, 52, without a single defeat, from 1969 to 1972. Let that number sit for a moment. 52 races in a row, in a car that looked like something your accountant would drive to the office on a Monday morning. Built by engineers who started out making warplanes, carrying the DNA of a company whose name had already been erased from the door. After 1972, Nissan retired the GT-R badge. The reason was partly regulatory. Stricter Japanese emissions and safety legislation made the high-performance S20 engine increasingly difficult to homologate. The Skyline continued in various forms through the 1970s and into the 80s, but without the GT-R designation. Some of those cars were genuinely accomplished. The R30 Skyline, in particular, developed a quiet following among enthusiasts who appreciated its engineering integrity, but none of them were what Sakurai had built. The badge waited. The reputation rested. 16 years passed. Then came 1989, the R32. The R32 Nissan Skyline GT-R arrived, and the automotive world had to stop and recalibrate. Twin turbocharged inline-6 engine, 4-wheel drive through the ATTSA ETS system, 4-wheel steering via Super Hickas. The official power output was 280 horsepower, a number that anyone who drove one quickly understood to be a significant understatement. Agreed upon largely to avoid upsetting the Japanese domestic market's informal gentleman's agreement on power limits. Nissan entered the R32 in Australian touring car racing. It won, comprehensively and repeatedly. The organizers eventually changed the technical regulations specifically to slow it down. The car earned the nickname Godzilla not because of its dimensions, but because of what it did to everything it encountered on a circuit. The R33 refined the formula. The R34 became a cultural monument. Gran Turismo introduced it to millions of living rooms from the late 1990s onwards. Fast and Furious put it on cinema screens in 6 separate films. A generation of men who had never set foot in Japan grew up knowing what a Skyline GT-R was and what it meant. The car had transcended the category of automobile and become a symbol of precision, of underdog triumph, of Japanese engineering refusing to accept the limits others set for it. But here is what almost none of those people in those living rooms understood. The car on their screen, the one chasing supercars around the Nürburgring and setting lap records that embarrassed machines, costing 3 times the price. That car's story did not begin with Nissan. It began in a disbanded aircraft factory in Tokyo in 1945. It began with engineers who were forbidden from building the things they knew how to build and found another way to be extraordinary. It ran through a company named after a crown prince, through a race at Suzuka in 1964, where a family sedan drifted its way into second place against a German racing car, and through one-man Shinichiro Sakurai, who carried the soul of Prince Motor Company into the halls of Nissan and refused to let it be diluted. Sakurai continued working at Nissan for many years after the merger. He received recognition within Japanese motorsport circles, genuine recognition, late but real. He died in 2012, aged 83. The tributes from the motorsport community were extraordinary, an acknowledgement, long overdue, of how much one engineer's stubbornness had shaped an entire lineage of machines. Today, the Prince R380 sits in the Nissan Heritage Collection. The original S54 Skyline GT that chased the Porsche at Suzuka in 1964 was fully restored for the 50th anniversary of Suzuka Circuit in 2012. Nissan has since launched a restoration program for the R32, R33, and R34. These cars are not being treated as museum pieces. They are being treated as living things worth preserving, proof that the legacy is understood, even if the name that started it has been allowed to fade. The name on the door still says Nissan. There is something quietly instructive about the way Prince Motor Company ended. They didn't fail. They didn't collapse under a catastrophic product, a ruinous scandal, or simple commercial incompetence. They built excellent cars. They proved their engineering at the highest level available to them. They won races. And then the economics of the industry made them inconvenient to exist as an independent entity, and a larger company absorbed them. The name disappeared, the people stayed, and the work those people had done, the philosophy they had built, the standards they refused to compromise, became the foundation of something the world would eventually call one of the greatest driver's cars ever made. That is not an accident. That is what engineering culture actually looks like when it survives a hostile transition, not in the logo, in the decisions, in the refusal, embedded in the institutional memory of the people who stayed, to build anything less than the best version of the thing they were trying to build. Prince was never the biggest company. They didn't have Toyota's resources or Nissan's scale. What they had was a workforce trained to aircraft standards, in an industry where aircraft standards were entirely unnecessary, and they applied those standards anyway, because they did not know how to do anything less. That showed up in 1957, in the double wishbone suspension, on a family saloon. It showed up in 1964 in a stretched sedan that led a German factory racing car for one lap on mismatched tires. It lived in the S20 engine. And it survived 16 years of dormancy and a corporate merger to return in 1989 as the car that broke Australian touring car racing. The lesson here is not sentimental, it is precise and practical, and it applies well beyond the world of cars. The people who build something great are rarely the ones history remembers. Prince Motor Company gave Nissan the engineering culture, the Skyline platform, the racing credibility, and the key engineer who fathered the GT-R. In return, they got absorbed and reduced to a footnote. The inheritor got the crown. But the car remembers. Every GT-R that has ever turned a wheel is, in some real and traceable part of itself, a Prince. Built on work done by aircraft engineers who refused to stop being excellent just because the world had rearranged itself around them. So here is what you now know that most people don't. The car in 6 Fast and Furious films. The car that broke the Nürburgring's expectations of what a production saloon could do. The car a generation of men drove 10,000 virtual laps in because they could not afford the real thing. That car's bloodline does not begin with Nissan. It begins with a disbanded warplane factory, a crown prince, one lap at Suzuka in 1964, and a man named Shinichiro Sakurai who spent his entire career refusing to build anything he wasn't proud of. The Prince Motor Company built a legend and never got to wear its crown. But if you know where to look in the suspension geometry of a 1957 family saloon, in the number 39 car sliding through a corner on bad tires, in 52 consecutive race victories, in a 4-door box, the crown is there. It was always there, just wearing a different badge. If this video gave you something, a story you hadn't heard, a name worth remembering, then subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. Every week, the real history behind the machines. The people behind the decisions. The stories that didn't make it into the brochure. Hit subscribe. Leave a comment below before today. Did you know the GT-R story started with Prince Motor Company? Tell us where you first saw a Skyline GT-R and what it did to you. And if you've got a friend who cares about the real stories behind the cars they love, share this video with them. Tell them it's about the company that built the legend and got erased. Like if it earned it. Subscribe if you want more. We'll see you on the next one.